Hey, Ray.
Hey, how you doing, Martin?
Good morning. Good morning. How are you? Hi, good morning. Good to see you. Thanks for having us.
We ready? Good morning. Let me welcome all of you here. And joining us, of course, is the state president of the NAACP, the Honorable Hazel Dukes, representative for Assemblywoman Latrice Walker, who was going to be here but had a family emergency, and from CPC, Sister Cohen. Is that right? Let me say that it is significant to us in the civil rights community that Congressman Dan Goldman has decided to introduce as his first bill in Congress something that strikes to the heart of American democracy, and that he chose and asked to come and announce it here, where we have fought for voting rights all of our decades of existence and have hosted everyone from Mrs. Coretta Scott King many times to John Lewis to Jesse Jackson, who mentored me, and who right here, President Obama and Clinton and others have come. The threat to voting rights is real. The threat to voting rights is not something that we can fear in the long run. It is immediate, and it is the core of civil rights in this country. We cannot just fight to maintain democracy in Ukraine, and we should, and not have democracy all over the United States practiced where it is easily and available to citizens. And a lot of these barriers are set up particularly to deal with people of color. So for Dan Goldman to stand up and lead this charge, we at National Action Network are glad he chose to do it from our platform. We are calling on members of Congress to support him. I would hope in the next coming days, the Congressional Black Caucus and others come and flank him on this. This is a bipartisan bill. I would hope that members in the Republican Party will remember they once had a member of the party named Abe Lincoln, and that they should be standing for equal access. The three principles that he will outline works for everybody, Republican or Democrat. To say you want to have more locations, to say that you want to be able to count the votes as they go, the three things he will outline will work for either party. So it's not a setup that will help just one party. It's a setup that would assure equal access and even access and accountability to everyone. So it is great pride I bring you the author of this bill, someone that once he was elected, one of his first stops he came to see us, so he's not a stranger to us, but even more important, he is dealing with a problem that is too familiar to us, Congressman Dan Goldman.
Thank you very much, Rev. It's really great to be here at the National Action Network in the House of Justice to be able to make this announcement. And I'm very honored to be flanked, in addition to Reverend Sharpton, with some real, true civil rights leaders who have been fighting for equal justice and civil rights for decades. And let me introduce our next speaker, who is a legend in her own right, Dr. Hazel Dukes, who is the president of the New York chapter of the NAACP. Dr. Dukes?
Thank you so much, Congressman. And to my brother, Reverend Sharpton, he said it. We've been fighting for decades on this area because voting is the heart of the civil rights movement. I have looked at Mississippi and Alabama, but we got to look in our own backyard. Here in New York State, we did get a passing for the John Lewis bill by our senator out of Brooklyn, and the work that Assemblywoman Latrice Walker, who we've been with. But when Reverend called us together, the civil rights group, the Urban League, the NAACP, the Brenner Center, and so many others. We come together on this issue. As he said, it's not about a Republican or Democrat, green or blue or yellow, whatever they want to make of this. This is the fundamental of the United States of America. Every man and woman at the age that the state law says should be eligible to vote with no barriers that would hinder us from them. Early voting is very important. We really should have a national day that nobody go to work, that they could take to go. So thank you, Congressman, for this. We stand with you. This is the right place for you to announce it here at the House of Justice. Anything we want the world to know about, it comes out of this place. For many years that I had the privilege to stand here to sign the alarm that it's not about Republican or Democrat. It's about the rights. And that's what we're about today. And whatever we need to assist you, Congressman Goldman, we are here to stand with you. And most certainly, when Reverend Sharpton calls, we answer.
Thank you, Dr. Dukes. As the Rev said, Assemblywoman Latrice Walker was going to join us but could not because of a family emergency, and Assemblymember Al Taylor also was going to join us, but he is dealing with a tragic incident that occurred in his district this morning. But we are lucky to have from the Brennan Center for Justice, where I was honored to be a fellow for a period of time and is one of the leading nonprofit organizations focusing on democracy and voting rights around the country, Jasleen Singh.
Thank you so much to Representative Goldman for inviting the Brennan Center here today and for your leadership on voting access. We are proud to have Representative Goldman in Congress and as a Brennan Center alum. His leadership on democracy and accountability issues have been critical to advancing the cause. And today we are so excited to express our support for Representative Goldman's voting access proposal, the Early Voting Act. This act is an essential piece of legislation to protect the right to vote in this country. The Brennan Center has for decades been researching early voting, and in our research we have found that expanding opportunities for people to vote early are necessary for protecting access to the ballot and advancing equity. And it's simply popular with the voters. For voters who have job conflicts, transportation issues, or travel obligations, early voting can mean being able to participate in democracy. Providing people greater flexibility with when they can cast their ballot just makes common sense. And early voting can also help ease long lines and alleviate burdens on election officials on Election Day. And in fact, in the last 2 years, at least 11 states have passed 16 laws that either establish early voting or expand early voting opportunities. Last year, Connecticut voters passed a ballot measure that authorized the state's legislature to establish no excuse early voting in that state. And thus far this year, 41 bills in 11 states across the country have also proposed legislation to either establish or expand early voting. The Early Voting Act would build on this momentum, establishing a floor in all 50 states for the number of days and hours available for early voting. And states can always offer more days or more hours. And the act also provides several factors for election officials to consider when designating early voting polling locations, including, when possible, that early polls be located in accessible walking distance to public transportation, that they be accessible to folks in rural areas, and they be located on college campuses. The Early Voting Act is a commitment to the people. It will ensure that voters are provided ample opportunity to vote when they can and at a place that makes sense. This legislation was a key part of the Freedom to Vote Act last Congress. We were proud to be part of the push for that legislation. It passed the House and had a majority support in the US Senate. Setting a baseline national standard for voting, as the Early Voting Act does, is essential for protecting the freedom to vote in this country. And while several states have recently expanded access to early voting, other state legislatures have taken steps in the opposite direction. We still need a national standard to protect voting access, and we still need Congress to pass this bill without delay. Thank you, Representative Goldman, for not missing a beat and picking up the mantle on this fight. There is a pro-democracy movement happening in this country, and we are really proud to be part of it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jasleen. Joining us also from the Chinese American Planning Council is Carlin Cowan.
A little shorter than the congressman. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much to National Action Network and the Reverend for having us here today, and thank you so much to Representative Goldman for introducing this incredibly important act. My name is Carlin Cowan, pronouns they, them, and I'm the Chief Policy and Public Affairs Officer of the Chinese American Planning Council, CPC. CPC is the nation's largest Asian American social services agency, providing over 200,000 Asian American, immigrant, and low-income New Yorkers with social services ranging from daycares to senior services, adult literacy programs, youth programs, and more. Over the last few years, we've expanded our support to community members to access COVID testing and vaccines, emergency food programs, housing support, and other critical services. You might be wondering why a social services agency cares about early voting, but in fact, it is incredibly important to our community members. We work to engage our community members in advocacy around the issues that matter to them most, from immigrant justice to housing and healthcare. And voting is a critical step to that advocacy. Asian Americans are the fastest growing population in the United States and in New York State, and have the highest increase in voter turnout. Yet at the same time, 2/3 of Asian Americans are never reached out to by a political party or community-based organization to vote. That is a huge missed opportunity to engage a critical voting bloc. CPC has been working to engage our community members in the democratic process over the past several years, including registering 26,000 people for the census, bringing people out to elections, and doing in-language education. But when we tell our community members about the importance of voting and how critical it is to have their voice heard when they cannot actually access the ballot, when they cannot get to vote, then that work is for nothing. When our community members come and tell us, I understand voting is important and I want to vote, but I can't get the day off of my 2 jobs to vote. I can't find childcare for my child so I can vote. Or I can't figure out how to get to a polling location because it's not accessible. That means that all of our engagement work is for nothing, because voting is not actually accessible to the communities that need to be involved in the process the most. So that's why this act is so critical, and CPC's community members stand ready to support it. It will ensure that our voting rights are protected and that our community members can actually access this critical pillar of democracy. On a personal note, as the daughter of a Filipino-American immigrant, I've seen firsthand what happens when we don't protect our voting rights, because my mother lived that. And so I'm really proud to stand here along with Representative Goldman and our colleagues to say that this Early Voting Act is critical to protecting our right to vote and our democracy. Thank you.
Put this back up.
Sorry, I should have done
No, that's okay. That's all right. Thank you, Carlin. Thank you, Reverend Sharpton, for hosting us. It is my great honor to be able to make this announcement from this hallowed hall. I want to thank also our other partners in this, and especially when you start to see how much this cuts across every community, every group in this country. Voting rights and the dark history of disenfranchisement in this country has long been an area of concern for me. Indeed, voter suppression laws designed to prevent the least advantaged citizens from the ballot box is as old as this republic. It has taken many forms over the years, but it has always been a constant means for those in power to protect their advantage. When I was in law school 20 years ago, assisting Michelle Alexander on her seminal book, The New Jim Crow, I wrote a law review article about how felon disenfranchisement laws were the modern-day literacy tests designed to prevent people of color, especially Black Americans, from the ballot box. And as we look around the country, it sometimes feels as if we have made no progress at all, or that we often will take one step forward but two steps back in the effort to guarantee truly equal access to the ballot box. But at other times, we have watched our communities rise up against attempts at suppression and make their voices heard. Like in Georgia over the past 2 elections, where the Black community overcame efforts to suppress their vote by storming to the ballot box in droves to make their voices heard and give Democrats control of the Senate. But the anti-democratic strain of the modern Republican Party has added a new urgency to this fight. Republican governors and state legislatures across the country are working as we speak to remove polling places from urban precincts. They're passing draconian laws about how to limit how, when, and where you can cast your ballot. They have also pushed radically dangerous constitutional interpretations that would invalidate the checks and balances of the judicial system and allow politicians instead of voters to determine the outcome of an election. Simply put, they are working in broad daylight to eliminate the people's voice as the determining factor in our elections. And that is why I am so proud to introduce as my very first piece of legislation in Congress the Early Voting Act, which is a crucial step to guarantee the fundamental right of one person, one vote. That right is truly the foundation of our democracy. The Early Voting Act will make federal elections uniform across the country, no matter if you are rich or poor, white, brown, or black, Democrat or Republican, or living in urban neighborhoods or rural farmland. This bill requires at least 14 days of early voting before Election Day and including weekends. No longer will anyone have to choose between working and voting. It will also require that polling places are made easily accessible to as many people as possible, and on weekends when many people are off work and can more easily get to the polls. This bill also requires some polling places to be within walking distance of public transportation and at least one polling place on all college campuses. These provisions are all designed to ensure that voting is as easy as possible so that all Americans, regardless of race or political leanings, can gain access to the ballot. But we must also combat some efforts on the extreme right to cast doubt about our election results. The 2020 election was, by all accounts, the safest election in our history to that point. Yet conspiracy theorists on the right, including our former president, peddled misinformation about how ballots were counted in an attempt to undermine confidence in the results. These lies about how ballots are counted, or the fictional notion of voter fraud, which does not exist in any way that affects elections, forms the basis for many of the authoritarian power grabs that we are witnessing across the nation. We cannot let that happen again, and we cannot have a vacuum awaiting results that is filled by extremists peddling conspiracy theories. So the Early Voting Act also requires that early votes are processed and counted before Election Day so that we will get our election results faster and eliminate that opportunity for bad actors to spread disinformation and undermine the faith in our democracy. The right to vote is the fundamental right from which all other rights flow. Without equal access to the ballot, without fidelity to the concept of one person, one vote, our democracy cannot function properly, and our democracy cannot be taken for granted. As Abraham Lincoln famously said in his Gettysburg Address, our government is one of the people, for the people, and by the people. And if we are to be a government of the people, for the people, and by the people, then we must ensure that the people's voice is heard. In our constitutional republic, the vote is your voice, and it must be cherished and protected. Today, I am taking action in support of these strong beliefs that all of us in this room share, because there can be no true progress without legislation, and especially without uniform federal legislation governing our voting rights. This bill is a significant step to ensure equal access to the ballot and our only guarantee that Americans' voices can be heard. Our democracy requires nothing less. And I am so thankful to everyone here today for all that you have done in this fight and for lending me your wisdom and experience. It is truly a privilege to stand with each of you here today. I look forward to continuing our work together to fight for equal access to the ballot and to get this bill passed into law. Thank you.
Before the congressman and panel takes questions, let me just say that it is very refreshing to us as you have one member of Congress saying we need to have a national divorce and lead us back to the Civil War, that we have a congressman in New York that's bringing civility and accountability to the voting process. Not that I ever suggest to the media what to cover, but you can do Marjorie Taylor Greene here and Dan Goldman here, and that is where we are in this country. Any questions?
Yeah.
Congressman, I'm just reading the questions from the reporter. So you had answered, why is this piece of legislation so important? Thank you for answering that. Is there any hope of getting this passed through what seems like a very divided Congress?
I do hope that we will find allies across the aisle. As the Reverend said, this is not a partisan bill. We are not trying to pass a bill that allows Democrats to vote and not Republicans. This bill is simply designed to give every American, regardless of their background, regardless of their political affiliation, access to the ballot box. And that should be a bipartisan issue. If we believe truly in our democracy, then we believe in the fundamental right to vote, and that should apply to everyone. So there's nothing in this bill that is objectionable in any significant way, in any meaningful way, to anyone on either side of the aisle. And so it is my hope that we will gain some Republican supporters and be able to pass this bill.
Just one more question. Can you highlight how this voting rights effort may be different from H.R. 1 in the last Congress?
It is largely part of H.R. 1, and it is partnering with many of the provisions in H.R. 1 and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act to expand broadly, to expand access to the ballot, to provide everyone with the opportunity to vote. H.R. 1 obviously goes further. It relates to some other aspects of voting, campaign finance regulation. It is much more broad, and this is a part of that effort to simply provide not only access to the ballot box, but to encourage all Americans to vote. Our democracy only works from the people's participation in it. And what this bill does, along with other provisions of H.R. 1, is it encourages more participation and it makes it easier to participate, which goes to the very bedrock of our nation's founding.
Anyone else?
All right. Thank you all very much.
See, Red,